Homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Role models play an important part in all of our lives, whether we seek them out or not. And whether we walk the Buddhist path or not, they can have the power to shape the direction we take and the ability to influence the decisions that flow on from there. Life, with its ebbs and flows, challenges and opportunities, and at every turn we often seek wise counsel, examples that we can follow, and emulate people that we can respect or look up to, and much, much more. On the Buddhist path, the Buddha, for all intents and purposes, is our most eminent role model, teacher, and the Perfectly Enlightened One. There are also many noble and great disciples of the Buddha, those who have ordained as well as lay people, who were commended and praised by the Buddha for different qualities and or aspects of their practice. This will be a recurring segment on the podcast where we ask who are our role models and feature some of these great disciples of the Buddha. The aim is to learn about these noble beings and delight in their lives and accomplishments, learn from them, highlight the importance of recognizing them as noteworthy role models, and as inspiration towards the Noble Eightfold Path. Today we're going to look at one of the bhikkhus or monk disciples of the Buddha as our role model. And there are many to pick from in terms of Buddha's great disciples, but today what I've picked is Venerable Mahākaccāna. And he was known as the foremost of the Buddha's monk disciples, who explains in detail the meaning of what has been stated by the Buddha in brief. And that is Venerable Mahākaccāna. You can find that reference in the Anguttara Nikāya, and it's chapter 1, and it's number 197. And so the Buddha basically used to teach in a particular way. He had different styles of discourse to communicate the Dhamma. So he would often explain a teaching in detail, which is this vitthārena. And after introducing the topic, he would start with a short statement or synopsis, which was the udesa. Then he would explain it at length, which is the nidesa, and he would analyze it and draw out implications and sometimes attach a simile, so upama, to reinforce his point. And then in the end, he would restate the introductory declaration as a conclusion, so nigamana, and that would support the entire weight of his analysis. But on the occasions when the Buddha wouldn't teach in detail, so he would just give this Dhamma in brief, this saṅkhittena, it would usually be a little bit cryptic, so the statement was charged with quite a profound meaning, and the monks would often go to Venerable Mahākaccāna for clarification, or go to one of the other monks for clarification. But Venerable Mahākaccāna was known as an eminent disciple of the Buddha who could actually explain in much detail the meaning of what's being given by the Buddha in brief. And sometimes Venerable Mahākaccāna is known as Kaccāna the Great. So because there were a lot of different other monks who bore the same kind of name, and that was the Brahmanical clan name of Kaccayana, which is shortened to Kaccāna. He was called Mahākaccāna, so the Great Kaccāna, because just to distinguish him. So after Venerable Mahākaccāna's ordination, he lived in a place called Avanti, and this was his homeland, and it was in the southwest of the middle country where the Buddha dwelt, so it wasn't nearby the Buddha. And for this reason, he didn't spend a great deal of time with the Buddha, and this is in comparison to other venerables like Venerable Sariputta, Venerable Mahamoggallana, Venerable Ananda, who was his attendant. But there were situations in which he was available, or he went to keep company with the Buddha. And so there are accounts in the suttas where his intellect was demonstrated, and also his insight into the Dhamma was demonstrated, and skill as a speaker. And when he was around, he was the one that the monks would frequently turn to for help in terms of explaining the meaning of something that the Buddha had taught in brief. And so that's where you find most of the discourses, is where he was asked that, although he did actually give other teachings as well. And it's quite amazing. I think one of the things about, if you're interested in Dhamma in particular, Venerable Mahākaccāna is someone that is a really wonderful role model for giving those explanations, that you could actually cognize quite a lot from the way that he explained the Buddha's teachings. We'll take a look at the samsaric background to Venerable Mahākaccāna, because it often offers a glimpse of the qualities, the noble qualities that have been cultivated over many lifetimes. And then we'll also look at his final birth as well. And we'll draw on the suttas, particularly the Theragatha Upadana, but there are also many other parts of the Sutta Pitaka that offer some information. And as a narrative, we'll use Bhikkhu Bodhi's essay on Venerable Mahākaccāna. As in the case of all the Buddha's chief disciples, the Venerable Mahākaccāna's elevation to a position of preeminence in the Sangha was the flowering of a seed that had been planted long ago in the rolling cycles of samsara, the round of rebirths, and had been brought to gradual maturity over countless lives. The biographical sketch of Mahākaccāna relates that his original aspiration to a leading role in the Sangha was formed 100,000 eons in the past, during the dispensation of the Buddha Padumuttara. At that time, Kaccana had been reborn into a wealthy householder family. One day, when he went to the monastery, he saw the Buddha appoint a certain bhikkhu, the foremost of those who can analyze in detail what had been stated by him in brief. The young householder was deeply impressed by the monk on whom this honor was bestowed, and the thought occurred to him, "Great indeed is that bhikkhu, in that the teacher praises him so. I ought to attain such a position in the dispensation of some future Buddha." To obtain the merit needed to support such a lofty aspiration, the young householder invited the teacher to receive alms at his home, and for a full week he bestowed lavish offerings on the Buddha and his Sangha. At the week's end, he prostrated himself at the Blessed One's feet and voiced his heart's desire. Then the Buddha, looking into the future with his unimpeded knowledge, saw that the youth's aspiration would be fulfilled. He told him, "Young man, in the future, after 100,000 eons have elapsed, a Buddha named Gautama will arise. In his dispensation, you will be the foremost of those who can analyze in detail the meaning of what the Buddha has stated in brief." Now, the Theragatha Upadana relates that in this same past life, Kaccana had built for the Buddha Padumuttara a stupa with a stone seat, which he had covered with gold. He had the stupa embellished with a jeweled parasol and an ornamental fan. So this is the Theragatha Upadana, and it's called the Mahākaccāna Thera Upadana, and it's number 35. Now, according to this particular part, it was after he'd made this offering that Buddha Padumuttara predicted his future attainment to the position of a great disciple in the dispensation of Buddha Gautama. In this prediction, the Blessed One also makes other prophecies concerning Kaccana's future, which from our temporal perspective would now constitute his past history. The Buddha foretold that as the fruit of his meritorious gifts, the householder would become a lord of the Devas for 30 eons. Having returned to the human world, he would become a world monarch named Pabhasara, whose body would emit rays of light all around. He would spend his next to the last existence in the Tusita heaven, and passing away from there, he would be reborn in a Brahmin family with the clan named Kaccana. In that life, he would attain arahantship and be appointed a great disciple by the Buddha. Then we also have another section in the Theragatha Upadana, which is the Mahākaccāna Thera Upadana, again, same name, but it's in section 533. And this gives a little different account of Mahākaccāna's original aspiration to the great discipleship. In this particular version, at the time of Buddha Padumuttara, He was apparently an ascetic living in the seclusion in the Himalayas. And one day, while traveling through the sky by supernormal power, he passed over a populated area and saw the Buddha down below. So he descended and approached the Buddha to listen to the Dhamma. And he heard him praise a certain bhikkhu, who was also named Kaccāna, as the chief among those who could elaborate on brief statements. And so the ascetic went to the Himalayas, collected a bouquet of flowers, and quickly returned to the assembly and presented them to the Buddha. And then at that point, he formed the aspiration to become the chief expositor of the Dhamma. And the Buddha prophesied that his aspiration would be fulfilled under Buddha Gautama. So in this same series of verses, Mahākaccāna states that as a result of his offering to the Buddha, he never took rebirth in the netherworld or the lower realms. So in this Mahākaccāna Thera Apadana, which is in the 533, what Venerable Mahākaccāna says is, in the 100,000 eons since I did that karma back then, I've come to know no bad rebirth. That's the fruit of Buddha Puja. I transmigrate in just two states, that of God or of a man. I don't go to other rebirths. That's the fruit of Buddha Puja. And when human, I'm born in two clans, the Satriyan or the Brahmin. I don't get born in lesser clans. That's the fruit of Buddha Puja. So effectively, he never went to the hell realms, the animal realm, or the sphere of hungry ghosts. He was always either a deva or god, or in the human realm. And even in the human realm, he was never in an inferior birth or low-class family. And by that you can see that definitely it's part of the Buddha Puja that the offerings made to, in his case, Padumuttara Buddha. But also his virtue must have been quite impeccable, because if you remember when we looked at the one of the suttas on karma, that to be born as an inferior birth, one had to have, not good sila. And so it's good to also bear in mind that it wasn't just Buddha Puja, it would have been also, his conduct would have been quite impeccable, quite virtuous. In Venerable Mahākaccāna's last existence, or his final birth, when the Buddha Gautama appeared in the world, he was born as the son of a chaplain. In Pali they call it Purohita. And this was in the city of Ujjaini, the capital of Avanti, to the southwest of the Middle Country. In this birth, his father's personal name was Tiritivacha, and his mother's name was Chandima. And they were of the Kaccāyana clan, and that was one of the oldest and most highly respected lines of Brahmins. And since he was born with golden-coloured body, his parents exclaimed that he had brought his name along with him at birth, and they named him Kanchana, which means golden. And as a Brahmin and the son of a court chaplain, when Kanchana grew up, he studied the three Vedas, the traditional sacred scriptures of the Brahmins, and after his father's death, he succeeded him in the position of court chaplain. Now, the king of Avanti at that time that Kaccāna became chaplain was Chandapajota, or Pajota the Violent. He was called that name because of his explosive and unpredictable temper. And when the king Chandapajota heard that the Buddha had arisen in the world, he assembled his ministers and asked them to go and invite the Blessed One to visit Ujjaini. And the ministers all agreed that the only one who could handle the assignment was the chaplain Kaccāna. Kaccāna, however, would go on this mission only under one condition, that he would be permitted to become a monk after meeting the Blessed One. And the king, ready to accept any condition in exchange for a meeting with the Tathagata, gave his consent. So Kaccāna set out accompanied by 7 other courtiers, and when they met the Buddha, he taught them the Dhamma, and at the end of the discourse, Kaccāna and his 7 companions all attained arahantship together with the 4 analytical knowledges, the Patisambhida Jnana. The Buddha granted them ordination simply by raising his hand and welcoming them into the Sangha with the words, "Come, bhikkhus." So as a new bhikkhu, Venerable Mahākaccāna then began to praise the splendors of Ujjaini to the Buddha. And the Buddha realized that his new disciple wanted him to travel to his native land, but he replied that it would be sufficient for Kaccana to go himself, as he was already capable of teaching the Dhamma and of inspiring confidence in King Chandapajota. So that's quite interesting, that he was only newly ordained and the Buddha had already said that he was capable of teaching the Dhamma. I mean, that's quite remarkable. And I think that's one of the things about these noble great disciples, that they have cultivated a life of intense probably purity or letting go, or some sort of giving generosity towards their oath. So, in order to become one of the foremost disciples, they would have done something through 100,000 eons of lifetimes in order to get to that point where just by teaching of the Buddha, they would be ready to teach. And we're quite fortunate with Venerable Mahākaccāna that if you're familiar with his teachings, you actually understand that something briefly said that by the Buddha, he had this way of actually explaining it. And when you go into suttas like the Halidikani Sutta or the Madhupindika Sutta, you get to have a demonstration of the way he would simply or factually elucidate the Dhamma and put it in such a way that it was straightforward, and if one was ready, then it would be easy to cognize. And that was a real gift. And when you think about how we struggle at times to understand, the Buddha's teaching, the teachings of the noble arahants, and you become familiar with Venerable Mahākaccāna's teachings, then you feel very grateful that there's someone such as Venerable Mahākaccāna who can help us to penetrate the Buddha's words, to help us to understand the meanings and phrases. And if you're familiar with his particular treatises, his particular method of teaching, particularly in the Pethakopadesa, which is the Pitaka disclosure, or the Netipakarana, which is the guide, which is attributed to Mahākaccāna in terms of probably his lineage, then you really feel most grateful for what he has offered to the world. So having departed from the Buddha, in the course of their return journey, the party of monks arrived at the town named Talapanali, where they stopped to gather alms. In that town lived two maidens. They were merchants' daughters of different families. One girl was beautiful with long, lovely hair, but both her parents had died and she lived in poverty, looked after by her governess. The other girl was wealthy but was afflicted with an illness that had caused her to lose her hair, and repeatedly she had tried to persuade the poor girl to sell her hair to her so she could make a wig, but the poor girl had consistently refused. Now when the poor girl saw Kaccana and his fellow monks walking for alms, their bowls empty, she felt a sudden surge of faith and devotion arise in her towards the elder, and decided to offer them alms. However, she had no wealth, and the only way she could obtain money to buy provisions was to sell her hair to the rich girl. Now this time, as the hair had come to the rich girl already cut, she paid only 8 coins for it, and with these 8 coins the poor girl had alms food prepared for the 8 monks, using 1 coin each for each portion. After she had presented the alms, as an immediate fruit of the meritorious deed, her full head of hair instantly grew back into its original length. And when Venerable Mahākaccāna arrived back in Ujjaini, he reported this incident to King Chandapajota. The king had the girl conveyed to his palace and at once appointed her his chief queen. From that time onward, the king greatly honored Mahākaccāna, and many people of Ujjaini who heard the elder preach gained faith in the Dhamma and went forth under him as monks. And so the words of the commentary state that the entire city, a single blaze of saffron robes, are blowing back and forth of the banner of sages. And that's how the city was described. The queen, who was exceedingly devoted to the elder, built for him a dwelling in the Golden Grove Park. And so with this story about this offering from Telapanali, it's also mentioned in the King Milinda's questions, and it's mentioned as one of the great givings that was to be reflected on as a supreme act of generosity. So the queen, she was eventually known as Gopala's mother, and she was the one that actually had sold her hair when she was a poor girl. I think it's really quite interesting to note the blessings of generosity, that when you offer something that is required, or something with even the very little that you have towards one of the noble ones, towards someone who's entered the stream, there is much merit that can be gained from it, and it's not to be underestimated. And it's quite a thing to actually read that there was immediate fruit of her meritorious deed, that in her present life it instantly grew back. And there were many tales, particularly around Venerable Mahākaccāna, where good and bad karma was realized in the same life for those that were either had very good conduct towards Venerable Mahākaccāna or very bad conduct. And there are stories in the suttas about this. And of course, this is one of the good ones, in which this particular woman, who later became queen, had her hair instantly grow back. And it's not something that we can fathom, but clearly when you read these suttas, you understand these things are all possible. Now, one of the things about Venerable Mahākaccāna is that he actually, because he lived in the southwest of the country and it wasn't close by to the Buddha, it was very difficult, although there were ordinations, it was very difficult for the rules that had been set at the time for ordinations, like a lot of ordinations, to take place because of certain rules that were in place. And until Venerable Mahākaccāna had petitioned the Buddha, some of those rules hadn't changed. And the story of Venerable Sona is about very much how some of these rules came to be changed. And the other thing is that it gives us some insight into how Venerable Mahākaccāna lived. And basically he dwelled in Avanti at his favorite residence, which was the Osprey's Haunt on the Precipice Mountain. And the story of Sona goes that he was a lay disciple of Venerable Mahākaccāna, and he expressed this wish to go forth under him as a monk. But Venerable Mahākaccāna, seeing that the householder wasn't quite ready yet to take the robes, he actually discouraged him with the words, "Difficult, Sona, as it is to sleep alone, to eat one meal a day, and to observe celibacy for as long as one's life lasts. While remaining a householder, you should apply yourself to the Buddha's teaching, and at the proper times you may sleep alone, eat one meal a day, and observe celibacy." And so with these words, Sona's enthusiasm for ordination subsided. But sometime later, the urge was rekindled, and he approached Venerable Mahākaccāna again, and a second time he was discouraged, the desire for ordination, and then his desire abated. And then when Sona approached for a third time, Venerable Mahākaccāna gave him the going forth, so the pabaja, and the initial ordination as a novice, so samanera training. Now, during this time, the Buddha's customary thing was to grant both ordinations in immediate succession, so the pabaja and then followed by the upasampada. And particularly for those mature men who were endowed with faith in the Dhamma, so they had saddha and they were well acquainted with the teachings. And so the novice ordination would be given first, and then right afterwards the upasampada, the higher ordination, would be made, making that particular person a bhikkhu, a full member of the Sangha. But at the time of the incident with Sona, there was a shortage of monks, because the region was quite far away from the Buddha's own missionary grounds and from other centers of Buddha's activity. So it's isolated. And according to the Vinaya, the higher ordination had to be performed by a chapter of at least 10 bhikkhus. And such a situation of Avanti was that Venerable Mahākaccāna couldn't easily find 9 other bhikkhus to convey the higher ordination for Sona. And it was only 3 years later that the elder could, with trouble and difficulty, convene an assembly of 10 bhikkhus from different places in the region to give Sona the Upasampada. And when Sona completed his first rains retreat as a bhikkhu, a keen desire arose in him to pay a visit to the Buddha, and he had heard many times the highest praise of the Blessed One, his Lord and Refuge, and yet he had never seen the Buddha face to face, and so he wanted to go and pay homage to him in person. And so he went to his preceptor, Venerable Mahākaccāna, to ask for his permission to make the long journey to Savatthi, where the Buddha was residing. And not only did Venerable Mahākaccāna applaud his disciple's request, but he asked Sona to convey to the Lord an appeal that certain monastic regulations be relaxed to suit the different social and geographical conditions that prevailed in Avanti and in the border regions. So when Sona came to the Buddha and explained his preceptor's petition, the Buddha readily agreed. So first, to determine what districts should count as border regions, the Buddha defined the boundaries of the middle country, wherein the original regulations were to remain binding. Then he announced the revised versions of the rules that would apply in the border regions, though not in the middle country. So these revised rules were the following. Higher ordination, so Upasampada, would not require 10 bhikkhus, but could now be given by a chapter of 5, one of whom must be an expert in the Vinaya, the monastic discipline. The monks were allowed to use sandals with thick linings, as the ground in those regions was rough and hard on the feet. Monks were permitted to bathe frequently, as the people of Avanti attached great importance to bathing. Sheepskins, goatskins, and other forms of covers were allowed to be used. And robes could be accepted on behalf of a monk who has left the district, and the 10-day period during which an extra robe could be kept would begin only when the robe actually reached the monk's hands. So these were the kinds of things that the Buddha allowed, particularly to adapt to the conditions in Avanti and in those border regions. So you could see the compassion that the Buddha had and the flexibility that the Buddha had towards how things were different in different areas, and that gives a demonstration of that compassion and of that flexibility. We can see that Venerable Mahākaccāna played a part in things such as the changes to the Vinaya rule, particularly through his pupil Venerable Sona, who was the conduit for getting Buddha to change some of the monastic rules to make it easier for monks to ordain in those remote regions and to make the conditions slightly easier for them. And then we also know that there was a bhikkhu named Isidatta who was also a student of Venerable Mahākaccāna, and we're familiar with him when we studied Chitta the householder, and he was the young monk who was impressing the older monks with his incisive answers to difficult questions on the Dhamma. And then we have praise for Venerable Mahākaccāna from Sangha, the king of the gods. And we hear this during one of the accounts where the Buddha was staying at Eastern Park at Savatthi in the mansion of Migara's mother. And the Buddha was sitting surrounded by a company of great disciples on that occasion of the Pavarana, the ceremony of mutual criticism amongst the monks that terminates the annual rains retreat or vasa. And because Venerable Mahākaccāna would regularly visit the Buddha in order to hear the Dhamma, they would save a seat for him just in case, having come from a long distance, he should unexpectedly turn up. And on this particular occasion, Sangha, the king of the gods, along with his celestial retinue, drew near to the holy assembly and prostrated himself before the Blessed One. And since he didn't see Venerable Mahākaccāna, he thought to himself, it would be good indeed if the noble elder should arrive. And just at that moment, Venerable Mahākaccāna approached and he took his seat. And when Sangha beheld him, he grasped him firmly by the ankles, expressed great joy over the elder's arrival, and honoured him with gifts of scents and flowers. And some of the younger monks were upset and complained that Sangha was being partial in his display of reverence. But the Buddha reproved them with the words, monks, those monks who, like my son Mahākaccāna, guard the doors of the senses are beloved both among devas and humans. And then we have his declaration or his pronouncement in the Dhammapada, and it's verse 94. And in Pali it goes, Yasindriyani samatangatani asayata saratina sudanta pahina manasa ana asavasa devapi tassa pihayanti tadino. In English, the translation goes, the Arahant whose sense faculties are calm, like horses well tamed by the charioteer, who has abandoned conceit and is taintless, such an Arahant is held dear even by the devas. So what we can find from this statement by the Buddha is the confirmation that Venerable Mahākaccāna was actually one devoted to close attention to the mastery of the sense faculties. And this is demonstrated in other discourses in the Sutta Pitaka, that he often guarded the doors to the sense faculties. So Indriyesu Guttadevaro, which is one of the key charana sampano, the accomplishments in conduct, he was actually quite devoted to the attention of it. So it doesn't say that he was foremost at it, but he was actually very devoted to it. And I think that's actually quite something for those of us that are trying to develop that accomplishment in guarding the doors to the sense faculties. Often we call it our security guard. So Venerable Mahākaccāna, if we look at some of those teachings a little bit further on, we'll see how he actually attends to that and how he closely guards his sense faculties. And so when you do that, you're not fueling your sense faculties. They remain quite calm. And in that way, there's more equanimity around any kind of sense contact. And in many ways, because he lived quite remotely, he wasn't keen about going to the village. He wasn't keen on getting into any kinds of plans or disputes with the bhikkhus or with other people. Then you can see why the Buddha said that he's like a charioteer with horses that are well tamed. And horses in this respect are the different sense faculties through the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and of course the mind. And when it is such, then it is possible at some point to abandon conceit, the mana, towards views and other things, and definitely towards sense pleasures. But I think at that level of Venerable Mahākaccāna, you start to let go of these wrong views. That's where the conceit is actually quite helpful, when you drop that, because you start to see what is the right view versus what is the wrong view, what is kusala versus akusala, and then one becomes taintless. So this anasava, this is something that the Arahant gains. And therefore you can see also why Sangha, the king of the gods, held Venerable Mahākaccāna quite dear, is because when they see someone who practices so well, that has a very active security guard, has tamed the senses like the horses, has abandoned conceit, keen to hear Dhamma, quite taintless, then of course you would be dear to devas and gods. And so we find that reference in the Dhammapada 94, and it's known as Mahākaccāna Thera Vatu. If you're familiar with Venerable Mahākaccāna's teachings of the Dhamma, then you'll know that he appears 3 times in the middle length discourses and quite a few times in the Saṅkhittena Nikaya, Anguttara Nikaya, And then also in the Theragatha and other places as well, he's referenced. So there's quite a bit that I think would be quite interesting to delve into, but it would take quite some time. So I'd like to split up this look into Venerable Mahākaccāna as our role model into separate sections. So I'd like to end the talk here and come back to looking at some of the other aspects of Venerable Mahākaccāna, particularly his teachings on guarding the sense faculties, how to cultivate what Buddha calls as homeless, and various other aspects of his teaching at another time. So we can share the merit with all sentient beings. May all beings be happy and well. May all beings be free from suffering. Blessings of the Triple Gem. Wishing you all well. Teruan Saranai.